March of 2022, almost a year ago to the day, my dad and I took a trip to Seattle to visit some family. And while we were there, we did something which seemed unusual to me as somebody who grew up in American suburbia, bizarre even. The entirety of the time that we were there, not once did we step foot in a car. We took a light rail to get from our hotel to the airport, we took a bus to get to a museum, and we walked to lunch and dinner. Now, on that same trip, we went to visit some more family in Sacramento. And the contrast between the ease of getting around car-free in the urban neighborhoods of Seattle and the inability to get anywhere without a car in the sprawling suburbia of Sacramento struck me. And I started to wonder why that was. I Googled about it, I watched videos, and eventually I would buy and read books on the subject. This was my introduction to urban planning. Now, fundamentally, urban planning is the laws, design, and infrastructure that govern where we live, work, shop, and how we get between all those things. And since the 1940s, America has been dead set on urban planning that revolves around everyone living in a single-family home and everyone getting around by car. And while there's nothing wrong with doing that on an individual level, when it becomes standard for everyone in a nation of over 300 million, it has disastrous effects for our environment, for our economy, and for the quality of life of Americans. Today, I'd like to walk you through why American planning is broken, how we got here, and what can be done to fix it. So first, how did we get here? It's a common myth that American cities were designed for the car. This is false. For much of American history, we had cities that were just as compact and walkable as the rest of the world. Everybody lived within a streetcar's ride or a walk from where you needed to go. But this changed over the course of about 2 decades. First was the Housing Act of 1939. This law did 2 things. One, it gave money to middle-class white families to move to the outskirts of town, and it created the racist system of housing segregation known as redlining, shown on this map. 2 decades later, the interstate highway system would bulldoze right over many of those redlined communities. Here in Denver, for example, the neighborhood of Globeville, which is over 90% Latino, had the massive junction of I-25 and I-70 built right over its center. This was the case for many redlined communities around the country. On a local level, many cities began implementing Euclidean zoning, named not for the mathematician, but for a town in Ohio. This zoning essentially segregated land use based on what was allowed to be built there. That's what all those colors on this map are. This included making it illegal to build anything other than single-family homes in residential areas. This is known as R1 zoning. We can see on this map that all of the areas in beige are still, to this day, zoned R1, meaning it is still illegal to build anything other than single-family homes. Euclidean zoning also brought with it parking minimums, which prevented developers from making walkable spaces even if they wanted to. But the cherry on top of all of this was in 1949, when the federal government started funding urban renewal projects, as they called them. These essentially gave grant money to state and city governments to demolish their downtowns. This is what Denver looked like in 1922 before urban renewal. Notice the clock tower there. In 1976, it looked like this. There's that same clock tower again. One of these is clearly better than the other. And this wasn't an accident. We weren't bombed. This was a clear policy choice. And in case it wasn't obvious, destroying walkable cities and turning them into car-dependent ones has quite negative effects on our environment. The EPA found that today 27% of all transportation emissions come from transportation. And of those, 57% come from cars. All this is to say that over 1/8 of all emissions in the United States come from the tailpipe of an automobile. Now, many will excite at electric vehicles solving all of our climate woes. And don't get me wrong, for people who want or need to own a car, electric vehicles are certainly better than internal combustion ones. But it ignores the fact that having every person drive 2 tons of plastic and steel to get around will never be sustainable. And it also ignores that the underlying layouts of our cities are the least sustainable way to design cities. This is thanks to our old friends parking minimums and R1 zoning, both of which make cities more sprawling, meaning that between buildings, we have to pave more asphalt, lay more electrical wire, install more sewage pipes, install more gas lines, and all of this only serves to make our cities more sprawling. We can see on these maps Denver on the left, a very car-dependent city, and Amsterdam on the right, a city where 52% of people use bicycles as their primary mode of transportation. This is how far their sprawl goes. Despite having almost the exact same population of roughly 3 million people, Denver has destroyed far more wildlife and farmland in order to build their city. But not only is sprawl bad for our environment, with quite obvious negative ramifications, but it harms our economy as well. You see, the more sprawling your city is, the more you have to pay in taxes, because there's more infrastructure required to connect your home with everything else. The same is true of businesses, who are required to have massive parking lots, which incur great costs, but bring in little to no revenue for said business or for the city government. So when we do things like demolish our downtowns, our most economically productive areas, and we move everyone into single-family homes, the most expensive type of housing, what we get is a population that stagnates, but the cost to house that population dramatically increases. And along with it, increases the cost of infrastructure per capita. Not only is sprawl damaging to governments and businesses, but it's damaging to individuals' bank accounts as well. Car ownership is typically a 5-figure investment in a depreciating asset with high operating costs, far more expensive than transit, cycling, or walking, stealing a large chunk of income from many, disproportionately the poor. In 2015, Harvard University found that the single greatest factor in whether or not somebody was able to escape poverty was their access to transportation. Transportation is essential to participation in society, and such an expensive barrier to entry is insane and fundamentally wrong. And finally, our current car-dependent city layouts are harming our quality of life. Now, quality of life is much more subjective than what I've previously talked about, but let's start with the fact that you need to be alive to have a good quality of life. And America leads the pack in road deaths. The CDC found that America's road death rate is 2.3 times higher than average among 28 comparable nations. Now, in America, half of all car trips are 3 miles or shorter, well within walking, biking, or transit distance. So why do we drive these when other countries don't? Well, it's because we design places like our neighborhoods, shopping centers, business parks, schools, and recreational areas to be hostile to anyone outside of a car and dangerous for all involved. When the crosswalk to go from a neighborhood to a grocery store looks like this, I can't blame anyone for feeling unsafe in wanting to cross it. And in addition to feeling unsafe, would you want to exist in a pedestrian environment like this? I'd like you to think about the places you enjoy being in most as a pedestrian. For me, 3 places come to mind: downtown Littleton, the streets at South Glen, and the 16th Street Mall. The common factor between all of these places is that it's comfortable to exist in them as a pedestrian. You can comfortably get between shops on foot, socialize with your friends, or just sit on a bench and watch the world go by. But doing any of these things in a strip mall would be impossible, or degrading at the very least. And this has stripped our community of a lot of these essential human interactions. Now, all of this might leave you feeling a bit grim, to say the least, pessimistic perhaps, and it makes me feel that way too sometimes. But our cities have not always been this way, and they don't have to stay this way. While much of the change we saw during the 20th century was unfortunate, to say the least, many cities, including my home city of Denver and the city I've been picking on, has made real steps to make itself transit accessible and walkable once again. Remember this picture of what Denver looked like in 1976? This is what it looks like today. There's that same clock tower again. There are many policy changes that have helped in this respect. Some can be done with a simple change of law. Things like eliminating parking minimums to allow developers to make walkable spaces new areas, requiring new street design to have quality cycling paths and sidewalks, and allowing things like townhomes, multiplexes, low-rises, and buildings with both retail and residential areas to be built in R1 zoned areas. This last one is known as missing middle housing and is oft forgot despite being an essential piece of the housing puzzle. You see, most American cities have super dense downtowns and sprawling out single-family suburbs. But middling densities, like those I mentioned, are missing, severely limiting the options for where we can live. Other changes take more time. Building up this missing middle housing, as well as the cycling and transit networks to go along with it, will take time and money. But with enough advocacy, politicians and the markets will listen to us. Part of why Seattle was such an easy place for my dad and I to get around in car-free is because Seattle has seen more grassroots advocacy for good transit and zoning reform than just about any city in the country. And you can have that where you live too. The good news is most zoning policy is done on a local level. So call your city councilor or your state representative. Let them know these are changes you want to see. Better yet, attend a city council meeting yourself. Not many people attend them, so it's important to make your voice heard. It's important to make sure that we have a diverse group of voices, especially young voices, at these meetings. But even if this talk's call to action doesn't inspire you as much as I'd like it to, I'd like you to at least think and observe about how what we've talked about today affects where you live. Recently, the idea of a 15-minute city has become popular. The idea that regardless of where you live, you should be able to get where you need to go in your neighborhood in 15 minutes or less, car-free. Could you do that where you live? If not, you don't live in a neighborhood of people. You live in a neighborhood of cars, and that's a problem. Thank you.